At 10:20 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its power. For 6 months, its carriers had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. To the men of the WWII, the First Air Fleet, it seemed as though the sun itself shone brighter on the rising sun. Their victories were legendary. Pearl Harbor had been reduced to burning wreckage. The British fleet in the Indian Ocean had been scattered. Every enemy that had challenged them had been destroyed. And now, as they prepared for what was meant to be the final, decisive blow against the United States, confidence filled every deck and corridor. Below the surface of that confidence, however, invisible cracks were forming. The Japanese High Command believed utterly in the superiority of their navy, their pilots, and their spirit. They had come to see themselves as masters of modern naval warfare. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were considered floating fortresses, sleek symbols of a new age of naval dominance. Each could launch more than 100 aircraft in less than 10 minutes, a feat no other navy could match. They were commanded by veteran officers, many of whom had fought for years in China, and flown hundreds of combat missions before the United States had even entered the war. The success of the First Air Fleet had bred a kind of strategic blindness. Within the Imperial Navy, officers began using a term that would later become infamous kachikayo-bio, victory disease. It was a sickness of overconfidence, a belief that Japan's fighting spirit and discipline would always prevail over any number of enemies. Every report that hinted otherwise was brushed aside. Every risk that seemed to challenge the fleet's invincibility was quietly ignored. This attitude would shape everything that followed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike and commander of the combined fleet, was a complex figure. He had studied in the United States, understood its industrial potential, and feared it more than any other Japanese leader. He knew that Japan's only chance of survival was to deliver a knockout blow before American factories could turn their limitless resources into weapons. Yamamoto's plan for Midway Operation MI was intended to be that blow. It would lure out what was left of the American fleet and destroy it in a single, decisive engagement. The concept was bold but also deeply flawed. It relied on complete surprise, perfect timing, and the assumption that the Americans would do exactly what Yamamoto expected. The plan called for an attack on the small American base at Midway Atoll. Hopping the U.S. carriers would rush out from Pearl Harbor to defend it. The Japanese would then strike them with the full weight of their carrier force. To ensure success, a diversionary attack would be launched against the Aleutian Islands to the north, drawing attention away from Midway. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself, aboard the massive battleship Yamato, would trail hundreds of miles behind, ready to deliver the final blow. But the entire operation was built on a fatal misunderstanding. The Japanese codes had been broken. American intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked the Japanese naval cipher JN-25. They knew AF. The coded target meant Midway. They knew when the fleet would sail. They even knew roughly what route it would take. When the Japanese sent messages about a water shortage at AF, the Americans deliberately had Midway report a fake water problem. Hours later, they intercepted a Japanese message confirming AF is short on water. That was the confirmation they needed. By the time Nagumo's carriers sailed from Japan, Admiral Chester Nimitz already knew where they were going. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were waiting to ambush them. As the sun rose over the Pacific on June 4th, Nagumo's fleet moved through calm seas. The decks of the Akagi and Kaga were alive with activity. Mechanics checked bomb locks and fuel lines. Pilots tightened harnesses and studied attack maps. Engines began to rumble like a living heartbeat across the ships. At 4:30 a.m., 108 aircraft roared off the decks in a perfectly timed assault on Midway. The target was the island's air defenses and runways to clear the way for invasion. Admiral Nagumo held half his air group in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Their purpose was simple: to strike any American ships that appeared. The first wave, led by Lieutenant Tominaga, swept down on Midway in a storm of explosions. American anti-aircraft guns barked desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Hangars burned, fuel tanks erupted, and the airstrip was pitted with craters. But when Tominaga's planes returned, he sent a message that would haunt Nagumo for the rest of his life. There is a need for a second attack. At that moment, Nagumo faced a choice that would define the entire battle. Yamamoto's standing order was clear: keep half the planes armed for ships, but no enemy ships had been sighted. Reports from his scout planes showed nothing but empty ocean. The American counterattacks from Midway had been repelled easily, yet they had revealed that the island still had operational aircraft. Nagumo decided to rearm his reserve planes for a second land strike. At 7:15 a.m., orders were given to swap the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for general-purpose land bombs. On all four carriers, hangar decks turned into chaotic workshops. Heavy torpedoes were rolled away. Bombs were lifted on chain hoists. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks as mechanics refueled aircraft that had just returned from battle. It was a scene of controlled urgency, but also of immense danger. The Japanese carriers kept their planes stored in enclosed hangars below deck, packed tightly together with their fuel tanks full. The air inside was thick with the scent of aviation gasoline. Then at 7:28 a.m., a single report shattered Nagumo's plan. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, delayed by a late launch, sent a message that would change history: sighted 10 enemy ships. Nagumo froze. 10 ships. Could it be the American fleet? The scout followed up moments later: enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The Americans were not just nearby, they were here. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming halted, but it was too late. Half the planes were already stripped of their torpedoes, others were being refueled, and bombs lay scattered across the hangar decks. To ready a new strike would take time, at least 45 minutes, and his first-wave aircraft were still inbound, low on fuel and desperate to land. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu urged Nagumo to attack immediately with whatever planes were ready, but Nagumo hesitated. Doctrine demanded that airstrikes be launched in a single, coordinated wave with full fighter escort. To send a fragmented group was against every principle of the Imperial Navy's training. He chose to recover his first wave first, reorganize, and then strike back with full force. It was a reasonable decision by the book. It was also fatal. While the Japanese flight decks became clogged with landing aircraft, the Americans were closing in. From 8:30 onward, waves of American planes began arriving, first from Midway itself, then from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The attacks were uncoordinated and often suicidal. Squadrons of Marine and Navy torpedo bombers came in low, flying slow, outdated planes against swarms of veteran Zero fighters. The sky turned into a slaughterhouse. The Japanese fighters tore into the torpedo squadrons, cutting them to pieces. Out of 41 Devastator torpedo planes, only a handful made it back. They scored no hits, but in their sacrifice, they accomplished something critical. By drawing the Japanese fighters down to sea level, they left the skis above open and undefended. At 10:20 a.m., the battle reached its turning point. Nagumo's carriers were finally preparing their own counterstrike. Pilots sat in cockpits as mechanics cleared the decks. Engines began to hum again. Relief rippled through the command bridges. The worst, they thought, was over. Then came the lookout's cry that would shatter that illusion: enemy dive bombers, high above. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the vast Pacific Ocean was calm, deceptively peaceful beneath a blue horizon that hid the most decisive naval engagement of the Second World War. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, the waters around Midway Atoll represented an opportunity, a trap they believed would destroy what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had been unstoppable. Her carriers had swept across the Pacific like storm gods, striking at will: Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. The rising sun seemed eternal. But in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knew the tide of war would not always favor Japan. America's industrial might was awakening. He needed one more blow, one so devastating it would force the United States to negotiate peace. Midway was chosen not merely for strategy but symbolism. Located just over 1,000 miles from Hawaii, it was the last stepping stone before Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto planned to lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a carefully laid trap. Once the Americans rushed to defend Midway, Japan's main carrier force would annihilate them. The plan was complex, too complex. It required perfect coordination between 4 carrier groups, support fleets, and a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to the north. Japanese confidence was immense. Their codebreakers believed American morale was shattered, but what Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans had already broken his code. In a dim room in Hawaii, American cryptanalysts had deciphered enough of Japan's communications to learn that AF, the target of the next attack, meant Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the U.S. Pacific Fleet, set his own trap. Instead of rushing blindly into Yamamoto's ambush, he prepared an ambush of his own. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, waited northeast of Midway, hidden and ready. At dawn on June 4th, the Japanese launched the first wave. Over 100 aircraft roared into the sky from carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The attack leader, Lieutenant Tominaga, led his bombers toward Midway Island, intending to crush the airfields and defenses. The strike was fierce. Explosions rocked the island as hangars burned and fuel tanks erupted. But the American base was not destroyed. The airstrip remained usable. Tominaga's report came back to the flagship Akagi. A second strike was needed. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, faced a difficult decision. He had been keeping half his planes armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared. Now he ordered them rearmed with bombs for a second attack on Midway. Below deck, hundreds of sailors swarmed to carry out the command. Torpedoes were rolled back into storage racks, bomb carts clattered across the hangars, fuel hoses hissed, and the air grew thick with the smell of gasoline. It was a moment of vulnerability, but no enemy had been sighted. Then came a report from a Japanese scout plane. An American carrier had been spotted to the northeast. The message was late, garbled, and incomplete. Nagumo hesitated. Should he launch the planes already armed for a second strike on Midway or take precious time to rearm them again for ship attack? Minutes ticked by. The sea was silent, the carriers vulnerable, and in that silence fate drew near. At 7:55 a.m., American bombers and torpedo planes from Midway began their desperate assaults. They came in waves, brave but disorganized. The Japanese fighters tore through them mercilessly. Squadron after squadron was annihilated. American torpedo planes were shot down almost to the last aircraft, leaving the ocean littered with debris and oil. To the Japanese lookouts, it seemed victory was assured. But the skies above the fleet were growing chaotic. The defending Zero fighters had been drawn down to sea level to intercept the torpedo planes. Above them, unseen, came the true danger: dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. At 10:22 a.m., the first American dive bombers rolled into their attack. The sky filled with the shriek of plunging aircraft. Within seconds, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were turned into infernos. Bombs smashed through their flight decks and detonated in hangars filled with fuel and munitions. Fire engulfed entire decks. Men leapt into the sea as explosions ripped the ships apart. The transformation was instant and catastrophic. Moments before, Japan had possessed the most powerful carrier strike force on Earth. Now, in less than 5 minutes, 3 of its 4 carriers were doomed. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood stunned as flames devoured his flagship. The fire spread uncontrollably, consuming aircraft and crew alike. Below decks, trapped men screamed as fuel tanks ignited. Orders dissolved into chaos. By afternoon, the once mighty ship had to be abandoned. Only the carrier Hiryu remained. Her air crews, burning with vengeance, struck back fiercely. They found and hit the Yorktown twice, crippling her. For a brief moment it seemed Japan might still seize a fragment of victory. But late that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu. Their bombs tore through her decks, setting her ablaze. By evening, she too was lost. By nightfall, the Pacific was littered with wreckage and oil fires. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were gone. Along with them, over 300 aircraft and nearly 3,000 sailors and aviators. The loss was devastating, not only in ships but in experience. The elite carrier aircrews who had led Japan's triumphs from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean were gone forever. Admiral Yamamoto, upon hearing the reports, ordered the remnants of his fleet to withdraw. He knew the truth. Japan had not merely lost a battle. It had lost the initiative in the Pacific. From that day forward, Japan would fight a defensive war it could never truly win. For the Americans, Midway was more than a victory. It was redemption. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had turned the tide. What began as a desperate gamble became a turning point that reshaped the course of history. Yet amid the wreckage and glory, there was tragedy on both sides. Thousands of Japanese sailors went down with their ships, many still at their stations, carrying out their final duties with unwavering discipline. Survivors watched in silence as the flames consumed the horizon, a floating graveyard beneath a blood-red sky. The sea that had carried Japan's empire now became its silent witness. The Imperial Navy would never again mount an offensive of such magnitude. Its aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by the sobering reality of industrial warfare that Japan could not sustain. In the years that followed, Japan fought with courage and determination, but Midway had marked the beginning of the end. Every island, every battle afterward was a step backward, a retreat from an empire once thought destined to rule the Pacific. In the words of one surviving officer, at Midway, the gods of war turned their faces from Japan. As dawn broke over the Pacific the next day, the smoke from the burning carriers still rose to the heavens. Beneath the calm surface of the sea, thousands rested forever in silence, pilots, sailors, men of courage and duty. The battle that had begun with pride ended in reflection, as the Empire of Japan began to understand the true cost of its ambition. Midway was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, a moment when fate, courage, and tragedy collided in the open sea. And though history would record it as an American victory, for Japan it became something deeper, a lesson written in fire and loss, echoing across the generations. From the ashes of Akagi and Kaga, from the twisted steel of Soryu and Hiryu, came the end of an era. The men who sailed beneath the rising sun that June did so believing they were invincible. But in 5 minutes of fury, the illusion was shattered, and the empire's course was forever changed. The Battle of Midway would be remembered not only for its tactics or its ships, but for the human stories beneath it, the courage of those who fought, the despair of those who watched their world burn, and the haunting silence that followed when the ocean